Hello all, my name is Yossi, and today I would like to point out something that I'm actually quite surprised is not self-evident. This lesson is dedicated to the memories of my parents, my father and teacher Avram Shmuel ben Simcha Bunim, and my mother and teacher Chana bat Shimon. Over the years I've had thousands of exchanges with Christians about the Tanakh, what Christians call the Old Testament. These conversations nearly always center around a collection of verses from the Tanakh that Christians claim refer to Jesus or to some Christian concept or tenet, such as the Trinity or original sin. There are between 350 and 400 of these verses, and these verses are commonly referred to as proof texts. Now, the validity of every one of these texts is problematic for one reason or the other, and many of them are problematic for more than one reason. But that's not the point I want to talk about today. If we take a look at the sources of these verses, in other words, what books of the Tanakh these verses come from, we discover something that's very interesting. Isaiah contains slightly more than 5.5% of the verses in the Bible, while Psalms contains nearly 11%. It means the two books together contain about 16.5% of the Tanakh. When we compare the number of proof texts that appear in these two books as a percentage of the total number of verses in the Tanakh, we come up with a very different picture. More than 36% of the proof texts come from the book of Isaiah, and more than 29% from Psalms. In other words, Isaiah and Psalms together contain nearly 66% of all of the Christian proof texts. Now, why does such a disproportionate number of proof texts come from these two books alone? Well, most of the language of the Tanakh is Hebrew. It's around 99%, and the remainder is Aramaic. From the Exodus until the last prophet in the early Second Temple period, the Tanakh spans a period of about 1,000 years. If you consider how much English has changed over just the last 200 years, you remember that English technically did not exist 1,000 years ago. It's clear that languages change over time. This is also true of the Hebrew of the Tanakh, of the Bible. Another thing that's very clear is that the Tanakh had multiple authors. It's obvious regardless of who you think wrote or who you believe wrote a particular chapter or book. Well, there are typical literary constructs within the Tanakh. It's also clear that these different authors had different writing styles. It's also obvious that some books are more prosaic and others more poetic. Among the most poetic books of the Bible, two in particular stand out: the book of Isaiah and the book of Psalms. Translating poetic literature is typically more difficult than translating prose. The vocabulary, the style, the literary constructs, it makes translating poetry particularly challenging, but also particularly prone to misunderstanding, mistranslation, and if you will, to malicious manipulation as well. You see, the real reason that Isaiah and Psalms make up the lion's share of proof texts has very little to do with theology and everything to do with poetic language. Thank you, Kol Tuv, and God bless.